Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks a lot for
the request of Mohammed Hijab, we added you as the additional guest after Brother Daniel.
Put the camera on, so let's just keep
It's awesome. Thanks a lot. So yeah, I had a question regarding the absurdity of infinite regress, and I was like, how do we know that infinite regress is absurd? Like, especially in light of things like the Zeno's paradoxes and so how do we justify that infinite regress is something that is absurd? Yeah.
Okay. Well,
look, are you aware of the standard way that the absurdity of the infinite regress is explained, or do you?
Yeah. Can I state it? So it's basically that. So for instance, just in the case of basically. So, for instance, in the case of length has to be made up of discrete indivisible chunks, because otherwise we'll have infinitely many infinitesimal chunks, and that would add up to literally nothing because each chunk is zero. And this is in a similar way, right? Is this correct? Or
we usually use the example in terms of the first cause, and a series of causes going back forever would mean that the effect today is not true. So in terms of a discrete length which is being cut off into infinite amount of units, where I usually don't use that. I just use a infinite regress of causes, and this is actually something which, even in the God delusion, interestingly enough, Richard Dawkins talks about this first cause, which is there can't be an infinite regress, and okay, what is the first cause going to be? So whether you're an atheist or a theist, the idea that there is a primary first cause because of the absurdity of infinite regress being real is something which usually is not challenged. So I'm not sure, what the issue is here.
So the thing is, like, you can't have, so if you're moving like from point A to point B, you have like infinitely many points before that, but the motion is possible. So in a similar way, can't that happen like backwards in terms of causes?
We need to differentiate between an infinite regress of causation and an infinite regress in general. Okay. Right. Now, my personal opinion is that the infinity in the past is not something which is necessarily absurd in that sense. It's actually conceivable, right? So, for example, you're talking about the infinite amount of lines between this point and this point. That's something which is conceivable. There's, there's infinite amount of lines, and that's material infinity, right? And people that kind of made arguments for God's existence, many of them were eternalists. And being eternalist means you believe that there was an infinite amount of time that pre-existed. Like Avicenna was an eternalist. My understanding also Aristotle was that. I have to double check his books, the physics and the metaphysics. But funny enough, Ibn Taymiyyah, in a sense, he believed that what you call hawadith la awwala laha, which is basically like things existed one after the other perpetually up until no point. So they all of these eternalists, they differentiate very clearly, concisely between an infinite regress of, say, time, infinite regress of things, whatever those things may be, and on the other hand, an infinite regress of causation. Now, what is absurd is the infinite regress of causation. Okay, that's where you have viciousness. They refer to this as viciousness. Okay, we're not talking about an infinite regress of time or things. That's not what we are talking about. We can make arguments like Al-Ghazali has made, like famously, like the Hilbert experiment and all these. We can make arguments, but for me, I prefer to sidestep those arguments. I don't care about those arguments. Me personally, I find the strongest way to deal with the infinite regress of causation point is exactly the way that Avicenna dealt with it, which is to say that if you believe in that, then there's the absurdity of believing that causes will be effects, and the effects will be the same causes for those effects. There's one level of absurdity. And another point of absurdity, and this is mentioned, by the way, in Herbert Davidson's book, probably the best book on ancient kalam in the English language, which is about Jewish kalam, also about Arabic kalam and so on these matters, okay? And of course, you can read Frank Griffith for Al-Ghazali, who believes that any kind of infinity in the material world would be impossible. But what Avicenna does, which I think is a stroke of genius, he says, okay, you want an infinite regress of things. You want, sorry, an infinite regress. You've got an infinite regress, no problem. Let's just assume that there is such a thing as an infinite regress. Okay, let's assume that infinite regress exists. Let's assume, no problem. I haven't got a problem. Let's do it. So what now? So is this infinite regress, is it dependent or is it independent? Now this is the question. If they say, well, it's dependent, then what is it dependent on? It has to be dependent on something which is either dependent or independent. And then the infinite regress will require an infinite regress of itself. And then you have another problem here. Or you could say the infinite regress itself, or the set of things which constitute the infinite regress, that thing is a necessary existence, that is independent. Well, we say anything that is made up of parts is generated. The set of infinite regress is made up of parts, therefore the set is generated. Therefore, it can't be the necessary existence. The necessary existence can't be made of parts. We're saying, therefore, that even if you presuppose the existence of an infinite regress, it doesn't solve the problem of dependence. Why? If you say, well, there existed an infinite tree, and I've made this point with Edward Tabash, but I want to repeat it in his debate. If you believe in an infinite tree, you must believe that with that infinite tree there's an infinite sun, because a tree does not exist without the sun. You can't have photosynthesis and continuation of life without the sun. The tree doesn't make sense outside of its ecosystem, because this tree has an ecosystem. The ecosystem is situated in the planet. The planet is situated in the solar system. The solar system in a very special place in the solar system, and the solar system is situated in the universe, Milky Way, and then that's situated in wherever it's situated. Now, what I'm saying is, if those chains of things which are situated in X, which depend on that situation in order to be what it is, that is an indication of dependence. If you have an eternal tree which existed before time, which means for infinite time in the past, you'd have to have an eternal sun. If you have eternal rays that come from the sun, you have to have an eternal sun. We're saying the existence of an eternal tree or the existence of eternal rays does not do anything, okay? But it just gives us more questions. Namely the question, what is it dependent on? This is the question that I'm asking. What is the infinite regress dependent on? It can either be dependent on itself or depend on something else. If you say it's dependent on itself, then it can't be, because we've already argued argumentum ad absurdum that it can't be because of it's made of parts. Then it has to be dependent on something else. What is that thing dependent? That thing has to be either dependent or independent. We can't keep going doing this. We have to have something independent. If we have something independent, then the existence of an infinite amount of whatever, so long as it's not causation, is not a problem for us. So it is theologically, because we don't believe in that theologically, but intellectually, logically, it's not a problem for us, because we will just say, what is it dependent on? We'll say it's dependent on God, or it's dependent on the necessary existence. So it's as simple as that. The infinite regress does nothing.
Yeah, I've listened to this point before as well. So I'm definitely aware that like contingency argument, it would not collapse because of like this issue. But the only thing is like what is the difference between an infinite regress of causes and of things, or temporally, or what is the difference between these that helps us understand as to why for causation it will be absurd, and maybe for others it's not. Maybe.
A cause understood is something which brings rise to phenomena. Okay, a cause is something which brings rise to phenomena. If something brought rise to something, which brought rise to something, which brought rise to something else, which brought rise to something else, and that keeps going on, then you would never get to the point where you are speaking from. That's the first thing. It's a matter of viciousness. They don't call it, the way that philosophers talk about infinite regress is not in terms of contradiction or lack thereof. It's in terms of viciousness or lack thereof. So they call it a vicious cycle or a vicious regress. Okay, it's vicious because it's never ending. It keeps going. It's like a bottomless pit. It's like a bottomless pit. We're saying that the bottomless pit doesn't explain the existence of anything above it. Simple as that. It's like when we go, and I've given this example, when you go to the sea and you see the water, you know there's a seafloor there. And you know there's a seafloor there because you know epistemically, using inference, that it can't keep going in that way because there would be no foundation. You don't see castles floating in thin air. You see them all with foundations. So what I'm saying to you is that the viciousness of the infinite regress it brings us to the conclusion that existence would not even exist. We can't have viciousness of infinite because existence itself would be jeopardized. And for that reason, I say it's the viciousness of the cycle. That's the problem. And it's also what is that infinite regress dependent on? Even if we say it's there, what is it dependent on? Can either be dependent on something else or not. And that's what we're saying. If we're trying to establish the necessary existence, you cannot stop at an infinite regress because the infinite regress gives us more questions than answers.
Thank you.
Okay. Jazakallah khair, Brother Samid. So we're going to come to an end now. We will be back, inshallah, next week at the same time. We'll try and probably go live a bit earlier.